The Vietnam War, one of the longest and most controversial conflicts of the 20th century, was a defining moment in global history. Spanning from November 1st, 1955 to April 30th, 1975, the war pitted the communist forces of North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union and China, against South Vietnam, backed by the United States and its allies. This war wasn't just a battle of ideologies, communism versus democracy, but a complex and devastating conflict that shaped the future of Vietnam and left a lasting scar on the global consciousness. In this video, we'll explore the origins, key events, and profound consequences of the Vietnam War. The roots of the Vietnam War trace back to French colonialism in Southeast Asia. By the late 19th century, Vietnam was under French rule as part of French Indochina. Resistance to colonial rule grew, and by the early 20th century, nationalist movements such as the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, emerged. After World War II, Vietnam declared independence in 1945. However, the French sought to regain control, sparking the First Indochina War. This conflict ended in 1954 with the Geneva Accords, dividing Vietnam at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam became communist under Ho Chi Minh, while South Vietnam, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, was anti-communist and supported by the United States. The stage was set for a deeper conflict. The U.S., fearing the spread of communism, the so-called domino theory, began supporting South Vietnam militarily and financially. The war escalated in the early 1960s. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, where U.S. ships were allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese forces, President Lyndon B. Johnson gained congressional approval to escalate military involvement. By 1965, U.S. combat troops were on the ground in Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign, began, targeting North Vietnam. The conflict evolved into a brutal guerrilla war with the Viet Cong, a communist insurgency in the South, using ambushes, traps, and the dense jungle terrain to their advantage. American troops faced unfamiliar territory, relentless enemies, and rising casualties. At its peak, over 500,000 U.S. troops were deployed in Vietnam. 1968 marked a turning point with the Tet Offensive. On January 30th, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a massive, coordinated attack on over 100 cities and bases in South Vietnam. While the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces eventually repelled the offensive, it shocked the American public. The scale and intensity of the attacks contradicted claims that the U.S. was winning the war. The Tet Offensive became a symbol of the war's futility, further fueling anti-war sentiment in the United States. Television broadcasts brought the horrors of the war into American living rooms. Public opinion shifted dramatically, and protests against the war erupted across the country. The Vietnam War was as much a battle at home as it was abroad. The 1960s saw an unprecedented anti-war movement in the United States. From college campuses to major cities, millions protested the war, demanding an end to the conflict. Images of napalm attacks, the My Lai massacre, and coffins draped in American flags galvanized the movement. Prominent figures like Martin Luther King Jr., musicians like Bob Dylan, and organizations like Students for a Democratic Society became vocal critics of the war. By the late 1960s, the American government faced immense pressure to withdraw from Vietnam. Under President Richard Nixon, a policy of Vietnamization began in 1969. The goal was to gradually withdraw U.S. troops while building up South Vietnamese forces to take over the fight. However, the war expanded into neighboring countries like Cambodia and Laos, leading to further devastation. Despite peace talks in Paris, fighting continued until the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. U.S. forces withdrew in 1973, but the war didn't end there. In 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a final offensive, capturing Saigon on April 30th. The South Vietnamese government collapsed, and Vietnam was reunified under communist rule. The Vietnam War had devastating consequences. Over 3 million people, including more than 58,000 Americans, lost their lives. Millions of Vietnamese civilians were displaced, and the country's infrastructure was in ruins. For the United States, the war eroded public trust in government and left a deep cultural and political divide. Veterans returning home faced a nation grappling with guilt and anger, often receiving little recognition for their sacrifices. In Vietnam, the war left scars that linger to this day. Agent Orange, a defoliant used by U.S. forces, caused widespread health issues and environmental damage. The Vietnam War remains a powerful reminder of the complexities and consequences of war. It was a conflict that tested the limits of ideologies, the resilience of nations, and the humanity of those involved. As we reflect on the Vietnam War, it's essential to remember the lessons it offers about the costs of war, the importance of diplomacy, and the enduring need for peace. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of history's most impactful conflicts. Please like, comment, and subscribe to Unfolded Stories X for more explorations of the events that shaped our world.